All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for sticking it out to the final session. This is the technology and surveillance session. So first up, we've got the findings from the 2016-2022 evaluation of the South Australian home detention study.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and then extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. My name is Cale. I'd like to introduce the study. There's a QR code to the actual report on the Department of Corrective Services website right there, and I wasn't here yesterday, so I wasn't necessarily copying the other ones. I thought I was being quite a bit of ingenuity, but apparently not. If that doesn't work, there's links there as well. I wanted to acknowledge my co-presenters as well who are with us today, Fred Zmudzki, as well as Jane Farron, the Director of Sentence Management Unit, Department of Corrective Services, South Australia. I would like to acknowledge the Boxar Organizing Committee for the opportunity to present this today, and finally the Department of Corrective Services in South Australia, who have been just a remarkable research partner throughout this project that began about 6 or 7 years ago. So I'm going to turn it over to Jane now, who's going to give a bit of the policy context behind the project.
Thank you, Jesse. So I'm just going to provide some policy and legislative background to the program in South Australia, which is an extremely successful program and has expanded since 2016. So I'll provide some of that background information and then hand over to Jesse and Fred to discuss the evaluation results. So in 2015, the South Australian imprisonment rates were increasing at double the national rates, and the projected prisoner numbers for 2020 we're looking at needing to be 600 beds ahead of what we currently had available. As a result, the department was investigating some policy changes, some alternatives to custody, recommendations to address those growing prisoner numbers. One of those changes was changes to our legislation in 2015 that were enacted in 2016 that increased our both release-ordered home detention program and our court-ordered home detention program, which was a new program as part of those legislation changes. So in 2016, a new sentencing option was made available to the courts to sentence individuals at the front end. So they were sentenced to a home detention option to be served in the community. In addition to that, the release-ordered home detention program was expanded considerably. Prior to 2016, we had quite strict criteria around the timeframes in relation to when prisoners could be considered for the home detention program, and they needed to have served half their sentence and be in the last 12 months of their conditional release state, so their non-parole period. In 2016, all of those timeframes were removed, which meant at the point of sentencing, an individual was eligible for release-ordered home detention. We also, in 2016, introduced our wraparound support services, so our HIS program, which is our Home Detention Integrated Support Services program. That was and still is delivered by a non-government agency in South Australia and provides a whole range of support services in the community for individuals on home detention. That includes different services to access rehabilitation and supports for mental health, domestic violence, gambling and drug and alcohol treatment services, independent living, budgeting, family connectedness, and also employment, education and training. Individuals on the release-ordered and court-ordered home detention program are subject to electronic monitoring and very strict compliance requirements under supervision. I will just talk a little bit about our release-ordered home detention program and the eligibility and suitability criteria. So the release-ordered home detention program is under the delegation of the Department for Correctional Services, so we can assess suitability and eligibility for that program, as opposed to the court-ordered home detention program, which is determined by the judiciary and magistrates as a sentencing option. So in terms of eligibility and suitability, first up, eligibility, there are certain offences that are not eligible for this program. So anyone with a sex offence, anyone with a homicide offence, and that can be murder, manslaughter, or death by dangerous driving, and terrorism offences are just not eligible for the program. So once we've screened individuals out at the point of sentencing in terms of eligibility, we then consider suitability. And there's a whole range of assessment considerations that the Home Detention Committee consider as part of the suitability assessment. So we look at risk of reoffending. So we look at risk of violence, domestic violence, and general reoffending. And in most parts, if someone's a high risk of reoffending, we will expect them to do a program in custody prior to being considered for release onto home detention. We look at their previous compliance on community supervision. Have they breached in the past? What sort of orders have they been on in the past? Have they been subject to electronic monitoring before? And have they breached under electronic monitoring? In particular, have we had issues where they've removed electronics and absconded? They are the certain criteria that we will consider. We'll look at prison behaviour. Have they had any incidents in custody? Have they had contraband fines, positive urinalysis, violent incidents? Program participation. Have they participated in programs? And if so, how has their engagement been in programs? We will consider intelligence information provided by the system, and we will also consider victim and SAPOL information. So on our Home Detention Committee, we have a SAPOL, or South Australian Police representative, and they will provide really useful information to the committee, particularly around the nominated residence of the applicant. Are there issues in terms of criminal associates at the residence, a lot of police attendants at the residence? We want to make sure that it is a pro-social environment that we're releasing the individual to. We will look at community expectations, and part of that is the length of sentence. So if someone has a 10-year sentence, we wouldn't look to be releasing them for 10 years on a community supervision order, particularly if a judge or magistrate has just sentenced them to a period of imprisonment. So we make all of those considerations as part of the home detention suitability assessment. If released, we also look at their structured day. That's very important, what engagement they have with if they've got work or training or vocational training. And just in terms of some numbers, so you've got an idea of how many people are accessing this program in South Australia. As of yesterday, we had 138 individuals on release-ordered home detention and 146 on court-ordered home detention. So we had 284 individuals who are serving their sentence in the community, and so not taking up a prison bed, able to access community supports and services and pro-social interactions with family and other services. So I will just hand over now to Jessie, who will talk through the evaluation results.
Great, thanks so much, Jane. Okay, I'm going to go through these fast. I have 7 minutes because Fred's going to present the economic evaluation. So I'm going to present to you our outcomes analysis for our release-ordered home detention cohort, the court-ordered home detention cohort, and then explain very briefly whether or not home detention reduces likelihood of returning to custody compared to a prison sentence, and I'll touch on the methodology we use for that as well. So just to get an idea of the sample between 2016 and 22, there's 1,260 individuals on home detention who we retained in our sample, and you can kind of see some of the characteristics of the sample there. I'll point particularly to the index offense for which they received home detention. In this case, drug offenses and administrative offenses were the highest. You can see information there on engagement in programs while in prison, and of course this is broken down by males and females, as you can see. And in the last column, you'll see we had information on recorded breaches of release ordered home detention, as well as returns to custody post-home detention. So that was after their order had been completed, whether or not they returned to custody at some point following the completion of their order. So quite quickly, we estimated Cox regression models that are sort of a time to event analysis to determine the percent increase in likelihood of a faster breach based on those the data that we received from corrective services, which is the administrative data. And you can see in this case, in terms of breaching release order home detention conditions, fraud index offense was associated in an increase in likelihood of returning to custody, 120% increase. I'm happy to talk about this if there's a question, but having a violent index offense actually was associated with a decrease in the likelihood of a breach. And of course, the risk assessment score was an indicator of the likelihood of individuals breaching their orders faster. And a number of days of integrated support services they received also produced a reduction in the likelihood of breaching the conditions. In terms of returns to custody, younger age at release, the number of prior sentences, which is typically a marker for a risk assessment score, which was marginal in these analyses, as well as whether they breached their actual conditions, all kind of told us about their likelihood of returning to custody once they completed their sentence. So we repeated that analysis for the court-ordered home detention sample. And here we had these are coming from different administrative data sources. So we had a few different variables here, as you can see. And you can, again, look at the index offense for which individuals receive the court-ordered home detention is a bit different than a release-ordered home detention. Administrative offenses, theft offenses, public property. And you can also see the proportion of individuals who breached their court-ordered home detention conditions as well as returned to custody. And right away, that, and on the previous slide as well, you can see that, on the previous release order home detention slide, right off the bat, obviously the recidivism rates of breaches, and particularly the returns to custody, are quite a bit lower than the recidivism rates out of prison, groups coming out of prison, for example. So we had to try and control for that. But in terms of factors associated with breaching court-ordered home detention conditions, having a public order and property index offense, as well as a risk score, showed quite a substantially higher increase in likelihood of a faster breach. And in this case, we saw also that the days of integrated support services received by the clients was effective in terms of reducing the likelihood of them breaching their conditions. Returns to custody were predicted by gender, as well as risk score primarily, as well as having a theft index offense. So we wanted to determine whether or not, and really at the central question to the research, especially from the policy perspective and the government of South Australia's initiative to reduce offending by a specific proportion over a certain amount of time, is we wanted to ask whether or not home detention reduces the likelihood of return to custody compared to a prison sentence. So really quickly, the way we did this was we requested all of the data for individuals discharged from prison over the study period, which is over 15,000 cases. Over that same time, there was about 1,300, over 1,300 people who were subject to release-ordered home detention orders. And so after sort of basically deleting individuals who couldn't be eligible for home detention from the prisoner discharge group based on some of the criteria that Jane had mentioned, you can see sort of how the sample got whittled down. And those yellow boxes represent the samples from which we use a propensity score matching procedure to basically match comparable groups from the release order home detention and prison group and determine whether or not release order home detention, those individuals are less likely to return to custody. And so we ran survival analyses, and what you can see quite clearly is the prisoner discharge group returned to custody quite a bit sooner than the release order home detention group. So on average, The prisoner discharge group returned to custody 407 days sooner than the release order home detention group, and about halfway through the observation period, around 40% of the prison discharge group compared to 23% had returned to custody. And so this equates into rate of return to custody. It's about almost 2 times lower for the release ordered home detention group than the prisoner discharge group. We ran the same procedure for the court-ordered home detention group. For the analysis on court-ordered home detention. So you can see that the selection procedure up until the selection procedure up until the matching looks the same, and then the propensity score matching procedure resulted in a match of 352 individuals from each group, and the results were quite similar as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to Fred now, because we've got 5 minutes left. I left him short the last time we presented this. Sorry, Fred. To basically provide the economic analysis.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Jesse and Jane. So with the now 6 minutes, this project's gone for 6 years, by the way, so we were thinking beforehand how we could even summarise it at all. And so it's, on one hand, it's been great to present with Jane and just describe some of what the actual program's about. Like my background is health economics, and so for me at SPRC, we overlap with all of these different programs and evaluations that look more and more at mental health and drug and alcohol and criminal justice and so on. So more and more we're doing linkage and these type of projects, and what this project's about are overlaps to me with that sector. And so we could go on and on about a lot of the different angles that Jane spoke about. So I'm sort of just setting the scene to say we feel like we've underdone our narrow slice of what we've looked at. However, not surprisingly, the economics does look completely solid. It's almost another thing that you think it's so obvious because it's a great program. It offsets high cost incarceration for home detention, and there's no surprise that it is cost effective. However, what we've done still, I think we've done some novel application to do justice to the great stat work that Jesse's done and some of the other methods. So just going through, what we're going to look at is just skimming over that. Methods super quickly. I probably only have 5 minutes now. But what I just highlight I was going to point with a laser, but I see we've got two screens. But the economics is basically split into 2 parts. So one part's, we know with almost certainty, it's really unusual in economics because in health economics we're dealing with uncertainty in all methods. So on one part here we have a lot of certainty because when there's an HD order placed, you've offset that whole sentence for that's the well-known bit. What the less known bit is what Jesse was talking about with the improvement, the great additional improvement from reduced returns to custody. So we've broken the economic part into 2 pieces. So I'll start to skim through this very quickly. Lightning background on methods. It's commonly used terminology that you hear the term economic evaluation or cost effectiveness or whatever. In economics, there are actually different subcategories, and just to get to the point here, we've done what is more a cost effectiveness rather than try to quantify the outcomes in monetary terms. So that's the approach we've used. You'll see in a moment why we've used it and that it worked very well. We could have extended this method, by the way, to look at some other mental health, the quality of life types of things. Again, I'm just saying that the more I recapped this to present today, I just realised we really haven't done it justice, I don't think, because there are so many other positive outcomes that we haven't had in scope. And the very bottom section, I'd really just underline that, is that with these methods in health economics, the methods for the last couple of years have evolved for very specific reasons, and that's mainly because we start from the other direction where it's really high uncertainty. Like patients, there's a parallel. Patients go to hospital, criminal justice goes to prison, you do a sentence, there's an intervention, either a health or in this case HISP or some things, and then there's the unknown, and often the economics is driven by whether or not they return, right? So reduced returns to custody is a great outcome, and it's the same in healthcare. Reduced readmissions or relapse or whatever with the health condition is sort of similar. So these methods in health economics have evolved to look at exactly that. That's why we've used them here, and they work surprisingly well. And I just say, to my knowledge, they're established methods in health economics, but to my knowledge, they haven't been used in criminal type research at all. Only 2 minutes to go, I'm getting the wind up already. And I think this study has shown that there's definitely potential to use those methods because they've started to help quantify some of the areas that are usually difficult to do. Okay, ramp it up quickly. 2 phases over the 6 years, basically to say at the start, I know it might be the impression that knowing how much programs cost is pretty obvious, but it's absolutely not. And for those that have, we know in every big government organisation you've got split teams and split FTEs and 5 directorates, and these people are working. So we went through a very comprehensive bottom-up approach, and then we actually cross-validated it with the finance directorate in a top-down approach as well. So we really did a lot of work in the early phase to do that. Quick snapshot of the structure of the model, the economic model that was developed. Basically, it just mirrors what Jesse presented, that we have the study group and the control group, and all of those arms just going off it. This is where in the economics we build in the probabilities of the way they go forward and the distributions and set up everything ready to run. This, in a nutshell, this slide's really just to say what I've already sort of been underlining, that we haven't done it justice. There are heaps of additional benefits that we haven't been able to quantify. We know the knock-on effects for families and positive career path and education and so on, not included. Super quick on this one. This is just the development of the program over time. I'm just showing this because it does come to bear with the economics. Often there might be a couple of years of development at the start, high cost, and then you're sort of getting delayed benefits for many years. But with home detention, it doesn't have a lot of additional upfront costs. And in line with what Jane was saying, it's just remarkable that the line that is just straight, I used Jesse's data just to put this one, just to look at how consistent it was. And the 2 little hot lines along the bottom that you can hardly see are almost exactly in line with what Jane was saying, that there's about 150 plus, 160, 70 in each program, and you can see that it's been steady almost the whole way along the 6 years. So utilisation, throughput, it's been consistent, and that comes into the economics. Budget story is basically over the 6 years there was about $43 million, and it was underspent. They only spent 31. We suspect a lot of that's got to do, or some of that at least, has to do with COVID years. I'll skip past that, and I'll spare you all, and I'll definitely skip past this, but it's in the paper, and this shows the way that we build up the calculations. The green arrows, if you can see them up there, are just showing that in the later years the cost actually reduced slightly, but that's not the full story. And then average cost per detainee, I could go on and on. I think I probably only have 30 seconds. The breakdown comes down to it's around 11,000 or so per detainee, and the averages are there. If it's 1,800 per month, more or less, that's not the full story either. This one is only backdrop, but basically it's just above the line is showing the green piece in the middle is the whole cost of HD. The blue bar on the left is the actual cost of all of the HD detainees that were in the program beforehand. So you can see just by orders of magnitude, the offsets are significant. And the piece on the far right are the returns to custody, which I'll get to now in my last minute. I could go on and on about what these pictures are. These are just showing, once we run the model, this is just showing us that the blue dots are all the HD different possible outcomes, and the little red dot, the red square, you can see is actually the control group in the base case, because there we're just saying that they had no prison years avoided. The horizontal axis is prison years avoided, and the cost is on the vertical axis. So you can see that the control group were basically around 55,000, which was half a year in prison, and they had no prison years avoided. So when we go through and run the model, then we're looking at the incremental change. I'll have to zoom through these and I'll get to the final numbers. So we did the base case, which at the start I mentioned was not including the returns to custody. This is where we add the returns to custody, and this is the part that I just think it just works remarkably well in a criminal justice setting, and that's where we got to see the blue dots that you can see sprinkled behind the red dots, so technical as it is just showing the distribution of how it added to the total story, because the control group, which is the red, actually had even more returns to custody. So this is the combined bootstrap and the confidence interval. I know I'm going to have to wrap. This is just a summary of the final figures, and it's very significant just to underline that the exact figures, usually in these types of evaluations, we're looking at the cost of a program and then the outcomes, and we're looking at an incremental change. But in this case, it's really extraordinary because we had a better outcome, like we've got a saving in returns to custody and prison offsets, and we have a cost saving. So that's why I've just circled there. Usually this is a ratio on the right, but these are just highly significant, highly positive outcomes. And the big picture is basically the program's costing 31 million. There was a combined cost offset of both the returns and the base case in the order of 200 million. So it's all these figures are in the paper. I'm pretty sure I'll be yanked off stage if I don't wind up, but I'm happy to talk later, and that's all. Thank you.
We have time for one quick question.
Thank you. I have a specific question about the court-ordered home detention version. In New South Wales, we have this order called the Intensive Correctional Order, which is the imprisonment served in community. We reformed that a few years ago. What we saw is that we got people out of prison, but we also net widened and brought in a bunch of people who weren't otherwise going to have this order up through. Were there some safeguards that were put in place to make sure that people who didn't otherwise get a home detention or go to prison will end up in that court-ordered home detention order?
Yeah, and I can also say we actually looked at a bit of an analysis from 2015, 2016 to 2017 that showed that despite the expansion of the program, the breaches specifically, because that's when they're under supervision, actually remain stable. But Jane, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, we actually had, as part of the alternatives to custody, we also had intensive corrections orders in South Australia as well as the court-ordered home detention option. We didn't notice an increase in prisoner admissions despite that being a new sentencing option for the judiciary. However, any individuals that came into custody, we could also assess them for release-ordered home detention upon admission. So even if they had a very short sentence, we could then review them for our release-ordered home detention program. So we didn't have an increase in prisoner numbers. It was a bit of an education process for the judiciary because there were some appeals around decisions. For example, I think very early on we had a 12-year court-ordered home detention sentence for a sex offender. That the DPP appealed that, and so there was, over time, the court-ordered sentencing option did evolve as well for the judiciary.
All right, well, please join me in thanking the presenters.